Okay, everyone, welcome to the Near Mysteries podcast here. I'm your host, Carson Melton, and I'm going to kind of run you guys through my final piece here. So in this final piece, I'm actually going to combine kind of a conglomerate of a few different. Um, the main case we're talking about here is going to be the Sweets trial. All my information from that is going to come from the famous trials database. But I kind of want to link some adjacent cases that I thought were relevant from some of the readings I've done in studying this case, and then kind of a podcast that I think kind of links everything all together here. Um, um, it looks like uh, I've got Lucy Pollard, and that was written by it was a piece by let me get the name right, Susan Lebsott, A Murder in Virginia. She wrote that piece there. Emmett Till, he was a kid that was brutally murdered in Mississippi in 1955. And then Ida B. Wells, since she was kind of like a catalyst for change back in the 1890s. So I'm taking it from the top here. Um, Kind of a quick snapshot. So on the screen you have here the Dr. Ossain Sweet house. This is the house that was, I guess, the centerpiece of the murder trial back in 1925. And just to kind of get a timeline of these cases here. So, I mean, going from top to bottom, you have the I.W. Wells, 1890, the Lucy Pollard case, 1895. You have the Sweet trials, that's 1925 to 1926, which is when this goes national. And then you have the Emmett Till case, 1955. And then you have the Curtis Flowers case, and I believe that was somewhere in the 1990s. Like that. And so here at the Garland Street house that you have in front of you, Dr. Ossain Sweet, he's a black physician. He buys his house at 2905 Garland, and this is in Detroit, Michigan. He moves into a historically all white neighborhood, and he was the second owner of this house that was black. So the first one basically was moved in. A large mob basically came outside the house. They made him nervous, and they essentially were like, "Hey, we won't do anything if we can buy you out." And so he took them up on that. They bought the house back, and they were hoping the next owners were going to be white. Obviously, the next owners were not, and that was a big issue for them. So they did the same thing again, and they formed outside the house. They formed a mob, and on this time around, you have the main character here, Ossain Sweet. He decides that he's not going to be pressured out of his house. He's a well-off man. He's not going to be chased out of this new house, and so he knows before he moves in it would kind of be a bit of a tension going on. So he initially, I believe, leaves his children back, and so they end up moving in at a later time. Not immediately as he signs the deed to the house. But he comes with guns. And so he basically, on his first few days there, he comes with, I believe, his wife, and he brings his friends and some acquaintances, and they basically, move into the house, and they basically have to purchase guns, and they're expecting this mob crowd to chase them out. And so at no point do they want to give up this house. And well, in the coming days, obviously, the mob forms again, and a white man named Leon Briner, who is kind of important to the story, he was ultimately killed in this mob violence here. So, culminating to that point, um, they're moving in, and the mob starts getting kind of loud or obnoxious. I believe that the report said there was a mob crowd of like 400 people on the street. I mean, you can kind of see the front of the house here and the corner of the street, and there's not a lot of room. I mean, 400 people easily encircle this house, and so that's essentially what they did. And they start throwing rocks at the windows, and so rock goes to the window of the top floor, and then shots ring out, and in good belief of their life being threatened, they were basically attacking the mob, being basically saying, you can't run me out. We're gonna die here, essentially." And so they fire a shot. It hits and kills this Leon Briner, who's one of the neighbors. And the police were on scene when this mob was here, so they basically promptly go in. They arrest Mr. Sweet, his wife, and all the friends in the house. And over the next few months, it was basically these two major trials. The first one ended up in a hung jury. The second one is the Henry Sweet trial, which ended up being acquitted. But Clarence Darrow leads into this. So the big question of the trial is like, was this murder of Leon Breyer, or was it a self-defense of this huge mob outside? So lots of deeper themes here. So tying kind of this case, we're going to pause that for a second and come back to it later. Um, Jumping over to the Lucy Pollard case. And so you can kind of get some feel for how the tension was in the Sweets trial, where there's this racial tension and there's this quick police presence, and so his trial ends up getting national attention. I mean, it's a huge thing, right? And it's kind of the same with the Lucy Pollard case, where in 1895, this white woman named Lucy Jane Pollard, she's killed with an axe, and so um, it's less of like your smoking gun story. The killer isn't as obvious as maybe like Ted Bundy or anything like that. It spotlights this social exploit, kind of like suspicion that moved toward the black tenants. Any nearby black people were automatically assumed to be, you see, the murderer. You couldn't imagine that male, let alone a white female, could even do something like this. So the local status of the politics of the time and the press, and obviously it amplified everything. But the legal system, it was a reflection of the community at that time, and so um, how is this really relevant? I mean, yeah, I felt that this was kind of a familiar case when there's high racial tension. There's this evidence, but it's kind of muddied, and the narrative kind of gets tangled a little bit by all these conflicting narratives of what the white crowd is saying and what the black crowd is saying, and it kind of showcases this fear, this white fear, that basically a rumor can spotlight a murder investigation on random people. And so it framed kind of how do I want to put this? It was the same pattern in the Sweet trials, where the state basically framed Leon Briner, the murdered neighbor. He was basically framed as ambushed. It was this cold-blooded murder. As the prosecution said, and it centered on this random white guy on his porch. But um, Blood Sox, her writing of this is basically saying what the press and lawyers aren't saying at the time, like the hidden truths behind it all. Um, so both stories kind of showcase the silence of kind of the sort of things. Another case was kind of the IWL case, and so that's kind of going back to the 1890s. So her big thing was just it was a simple claim. It's lynching is not a proper response to crime. I mean, just straight up, this is just social control of a population, of a minority population. So the target was basically black people, and uh, she says that the solution to this can't just be a local one. Like if we do bring about change about this can't be Mississippi is changing its laws, or a small city. This has to be a nationwide change. So she was basically an advocate for change in the area. Um, and so I think that was kind of less of a bigger piece, but I mean, she did have a role in her time, and it was kind of like the catalyst for change of civil rights. And I think all of these cases here are kind of civil rights cases. Um, I think the Emmett Till case is kind of relevant too a little bit, and so kind of jump into that one. So you go from like the 1895 case to you're in 1955 Emmett Till, and this happens in small town Mississippi, and he was basically brutally murdered. Yeah, I mean he was taken out of his house. He was basically bagged over his head and then brought into a undisclosed location unknown to him, and just basically beaten senselessly. His face was unrecognizable per like the ballistic reports, and so his mom was like, I want you guys to see what happened to my kid. I want you to know how gruesome it is out here, just to be black. And so she had an open casket, and it basically sparks this national outrage. It's like, well, what the heck, guys? We need to see change. So that one kind of mirrored I guess the feelings of Black Americans across the nation. They're just, they're outraged. We need change. And so, um, kind of linking all these together is, I mean, you have these key takeaways where, in the Sweets cases, housing, it, acquiring housing in any given neighborhood that wasn't a predominantly black one, it was just, it was like a racial battlefield. It was a war, if you will, with your own neighbors, not because of anything else other than your skin color. And so, kind of have another takeaway where it's like, these painted narratives are driving legal decisions. The prosecutors basically they minimized any impact that Briner may have had in the mob crowd, and they were just like, yeah, he didn't really do anything. I mean, you guys just straight up murdered him. But they didn't acknowledge that he was part of this group that was basically terrorizing this family, and it really just goes to show how um, scared they were. And so in the Sweet trials, resuming back to that, it kind of takes over the legal precedents and kind of, I guess, the advances we made since the Ida B. Wells, her bringing up that we need to move from this lynching problem and moving on from the Lucy Pollard case where they basically pointed out a random black girl and was like, you did it. Um, this basically says that we're in the trial of the Sweets trials, the judge, Frank Murphy, basically said, I want you jurors, you all white jurors, to consider the defendant's race and their prior racial experience when you judge whether their fear was warranted, whether they were justified in both carrying the guns and then using them once rock started going through their window. Was that a reasonable expectation of fear? And is that something that we can acquit them for? So essentially, it was a remarkable statement by this white judge. It's game changing. And so, um, in the second trial, I mean, it took a few hours when they ended up acquitting Henry Sweet, which is his brother, and they dropped the charges. And so, it basically overlooks that this Jim Crow neighborhood and these all white juries can basically look past the prejudice and come to a kind of fair consensus here in favor of the law. And so I thought those were kind of important. Um, I think there's a few takeaways. I'm just trying to keep it consolidated for the audience members here. I do want to bring up the Curtis Flowers case. I think that one was also kind of pivotal. That one came in the form of a podcast where I read it from. Um, Basically, the Curtis Flowers case. That was a 1996 case. So this is obviously 40 years going beyond the Emmett Till thing. And this one also happens in Mississippi. So it's in the same state as the Emmett Till case. And you can see that all those strides are made in the civil rights cases. I mean, there's still much work to be done. And so, this case, there's four people that were murdered in a furniture store. And basically, over the next few decades, I mean, this man, Curtis Flowers, was ultimately tried six times by the same prosecutor. Um, he was convicted on like five of these trials and with death. But they were all like super quickly overturned by the state Supreme Court, and uh, basically they were overturned because it was discrimination in the prosecution exam. There's also cases of misconduct present in the cases. So just as quickly as these convictions were being made by these all white juries again, they were being overturned by the state Supreme Court. I mean, they were just seeing right through this thing. And so that happened for four trials. On the fifth trial, they did manage to get a black juror. So in the four trials, basically how it goes is you have a walkthrough. And so the jury basically, in jury selection, you basically you cut people who could be considered impartial. And so in the second round of jury like selection process, the prosecutor and the defense, they basically pick out anybody who they think could be not beneficial to the case. You can just arbitrarily strike out these jury members, and what the prosecution was basically doing was just picking any black jury members. So obviously, if you get an all-white jury, you're hoping that you guys band together, and that was kind of the hope, and that's what happened for four of these trials. They did, they struck all the black people out, and eventually they did get these all white jurors. On the fifth one, they did get one guy who made it past the strike, and basically it was because the defense was like, look, I've noticed for four trials now you've been knocking out purely black people, and I don't know why you would think that this guy is not fit for jury selection, but he's qualified. And we think that your basis is purely on his race. And so I was ultimately he was able to proceed off of that, and it was overthrown. And so the one black juror did submit his verdict in that fifth ruling. Um, it came down to I think a 3-9. Forgetting how many jury are on the thing, but it was three people initially, and I forget the other number. And they were kind of hung. They were like, we three of us think that he's not guilty, and eventually the two people were they were basically I guess influenced to swing the other way, and so they were like, yeah, you know what, never mind, he's guilty. We think he's guilty, and just left this one black juror who ultimately just would not fold on his stance that Curtis Flowers was not a guilty man. He would not sentence him to death, and so he didn't care what the ramifications was for him personally. He knew he was going to change his mind. He had morals that he was following. So eventually, the case was thrown on the fifth trial, and the conviction, they couldn't convict him to death like they wanted to. The jury was like, I mean, you're lying in court. At one point, the jurors basically passed a note that said he was related to a gang, and he was just lying. He was basically saying he was there. He had impartial. He was impartial to his case because he had a bias essentially. And I mean, they were just throwing these arbitrary narratives, just hoping that they could, I guess, fame anything. Um, Ultimately proved to not be true, but um, in the short term, I guess, um, they basically deliberated and said, yeah, I mean, you're committing perjury in the courtroom. We're gonna try you for that. It was ultimately thrown away because there was no evidence of that. Everything that they claimed was considered to be false, and so in the sixth time that they went to convict him, the U.S. Supreme Court said, "Hey, look, hey, let's look into this because you guys have tried this man 5 times now for the same thing. It's the same prosecutor. We need to look into this." And so they find like serious like Batson violation, which is racially discriminatory strikes these black people, and the whole case was basically a racial discrimination case. So it ultimately it ended up going in favor of Curtis Flowers. He was, he walked, and so he wasn't ultimately sentenced to his death. But it's just a huge echo chamber of, I mean, these racial, aggressions in the courtroom and this regular way of life, just in the community. And so kind of linking all those together, I mean, it's just it's showing the stages, the civil rights stage. I think the Sweets and in the courtroom there with what happened between the Curtis Flowers case and I guess these white judges and these white Supreme Court members and whatnot, just being able to acknowledge there is fallacies in the case, and ultimately making these groundbreaking precedences in the cases, I think was huge for the time, and it's huge then, and it's huge now, and it's as much relevant now as it was then in finding, I guess, these laws or these narratives in the courtroom and being able to pick them apart for what they really are. And I think that kind of ties everything together here. Is yeah, I think the Sweet case, the Emmett Till case, the Ida B. Wells case, the Lucy Pollard case, they all kind of play a role together and they all kind of combine together. But I think that's kind of the big rundown of everything. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned something today. I'm not not like a teacher or anything, but I just found this case kind of interesting, and I wanted to kind of share it and give my research on it in hope that someone can take it and run with it, and maybe teach it to the next person. Just kind of understand it for themselves and understand how, I guess, the history of American history really plays a role in our legal system today. These big national cases all have a role in kind of the society that we have today. So, yeah, appreciate you guys for sticking around. And that's all I got for today.